Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and of course, I'm here with Mike Connor and Mike Simmons. How are you doing, Mike and Mike?
Doing great, Jody. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome back from vacation, Jody. Great to have you back.
Well, thank you. I was in the happiest place on earth, and it was tremendous. Had a great time. But we don't have a listener question this week. I know you guys enjoy those listener questions. So before we get going, let me throw it out there. If you have a question you would like Mike and Mike to answer, send it our way and we will get it on the show. If you don't want your name included, let us know, because sometimes I know you have sensitive questions. Mike, how can people get a question to us?
Best way to get a question to us, actually, there's a couple of ways. One would be hello@catalystsale.com. Another approach would be to fill out the contact us form on our website. And both Mike and I are pretty active on Twitter, both on our personal accounts and on the Catalyst Sale account. So you can tweet questions to @CatalystSale, or you can tweet to us individually.
Yeah, especially if you want to talk about race cars or
Jeeps,
the
jets.
The personal account, I would say with mine, just don't dabble in that for too long, because you'll say, wait a second, is this a Catalyst guy, or what? Does this guy really work, or does he just play with cars? Or so I do keep the two a little bit.
Well, I know most people would look
separated.
at mine and they think, what does this guy cook? And just all he does is smoke meat.
Yeah, I actually spend more time updating my grandson's account, his Twitter account. I opened that up the day he was born. So if you ever want to really see what's going on, you can visit at Gavin821. He's a pretty active little Twitter guy. He retweets a lot of our stuff.
He's an active Twitter guy, and it's just awesome to see how he's developed from when he popped out to where he is today.
Yeah. So he'll have, the only downside I think is going to be when he goes to get his first job, and I don't know, he's 4 now, so he's got 4 years of history. When he goes and the HR person says, "Yeah, we looked at your social media accounts," and he's like, "I have nothing to hide." It goes back to day one. And I wasn't responsible for the content the first decade or whatever. But anyhow, so topic for today is something I've been thinking about. Actually, I was going through the catalog of all of the podcasts and just sort of kind of organizing the inventory and what we've covered and what gaps we have. And one of the things that I noticed that we haven't talked about, at least explicitly in an episode, is the idea of dealing with objections. Those barriers and those things that we run into during the sales process that hinder our progress, or in a lot of cases, we find ourselves going from having momentum to all of a sudden, nothing's moving forward, we're not hearing from anybody, those kinds of things. And it kind of dawned on me that we really haven't talked about objections and how is that part of the communication process, and how do we deal with that? And what can you do to kind of keep moving things forward when you do run into objections? What do you think about that as a topic?
It's an awesome topic. And as sales professionals, I guess depending on what you're selling and how you're selling, you're going to run into this often. And many times as a rep, you want to raise objections. So you come up with different ways to incorporate that. And then there are other times where you want to avoid objections. So, all right, objection handling.
So why don't we start by, let's define, what do we consider to be an objection? I mean, it's a common term that gets thrown around in our world, but what would you define an objection as, or different types? Maybe we could start there.
I think the easy one is price. So you get that first price objection.
Right.
And that price objection could be in the format of, wow, we're not spending that much with our current provider. Or it could be, crap, I don't have budget. I don't know how many of them say crap, but I don't have budget to support that. Or, wow, you're expensive. So price is a common one.
Yeah, we actually just had one this week, and at the subject line on the email was sticker shock. There was no way I was going to miss that. As it wasn't subtle. It was right up front to say, wow, that was sticker shock. And what was interesting was that was an opportunity that was really moving forward pretty quickly. From my perspective, I thought it was moving a little too quickly, and I, without understanding what the requirements were and really what problem we were trying to solve, they really had us on a fast track to, let's do all this stuff and just let us know how much it is, kind of thing. And from having previous conversations with other people in the organization, I knew that it was going to be an issue, that funding was going to be an issue. And so it was a way to sort of, like you said, ask the questions that you know are going to drive the objections. Really, the idea was, let's just be transparent and upfront about what this would look like and get that immediate feedback versus strolling down the trail thinking that 3 months from now we're going to end up doing a deal only to find out that they would get sticker shock later after we'd invested a ton of time in pursuing an opportunity. So, knowing that it was going to come up, I figured let's get it over with and then find out more detail behind that. Obviously I went back and said, okay, well, let me find out more about what your expectations were or what budget you are working with and things like that. And so it didn't necessarily become the dead end, but I knew that that was an objection that was very real that we were going to have to talk about. But there are a number of other kinds of objections too. And sometimes I think the most painful one that I always hear our team talk about is basically when a contact that you've been talking to goes dark or just goes silent and all of a sudden doesn't respond or doesn't want to engage any further and just seems to have disappeared off of the face of the earth. And I know we've made light of the fact that there was a technique out there that, man, it still pops up once in a while, but the technique of sending pictures of rhinos stomping over people and saying, hey, did you get trampled by a rhino or blah, blah, blah. Anyhow, it's frustrating when you feel like you've got some momentum, but that's probably the most difficult objection is when you just can't connect and you can't, move the conversation forward. And you'd almost rather have it's not right or the timing's not right or whatever the case might be, but at least you'd have an answer. So, just to kind of keep moving forward.
When I heard someone tell a story recently where, one way that they tried to disconnect was they left their butler pager in the room. And then the butler went out onto the beach and handed said pager or said phone to some people. So, sometimes you just can't be in front of the customer. So, and those are really tough ones. I mean, like we have clients across the globe and, you can get on an airplane, you can fly out and you can knock on somebody's door or you can go into their room, grab the phone and walk out and meet them on the beach. But so when you get into this, they've gone dark or they've gone quiet objection and you can't, and they're in another time zone. What are some of the things you do?
So one of the things that I do is I try and see if maybe it's just that. So this is one possible scenario. They don't want to move forward. They've made a decision or they've gone another direction, but they don't want to, they've either appreciated working with you or they've recognized you've put some effort into this thing. And what they're afraid to do is have that conversation. They don't want to say no, or they don't want to have that, it's kind of, I don't want to call it conflict avoidance because it's not really a conflict thing, but it's that kind of, they just don't want to have that tough conversation. And so they just figure if they go quiet on you, that eventually you'll just sort of dissipate and go away. And, what I'd rather have is if the answer is a no and it's not going to move forward, I try and communicate in a way that would, and usually this has to either happen in a concise email or a voicemail, but just letting them know, I understand if the timing isn't right or things aren't moving forward, just let me know that. And one or two things usually happens with that. Well, three things. They still stay dark on you. So, okay, they are just hoping I go away. Or they'll respond back and say, we're very busy with 3 other things right now. This isn't the top priority. And so here's what the timing looks like. And let's reengage when the timing is right, which is great because then you know where you stand. Or, they'll just let you know that, yeah, it's just not going to move forward or it's not going to fit for us, but at least you have an answer. But the way you construct that message or the way you deliver that message is in a very easygoing sort of, I'm just looking for an update, no harm, no foul. We'll part company friends and who knows, maybe our paths will cross again somewhere down the road. Just something along those lines seems to work.
Yeah. A lot of times I just try to appeal to kind of their sense of being human or their humanity, which is, look, we all have bosses. We all have people that we report to. Some report to their boss at home. Some report to their boss at work, but you've got other people who might be engaged in that conversation or are looking for an update. So most people, even when they go dark, they can understand that the reason you're asking isn't to just be a pain in the butt to them. It's because you've got some kind of an update that you need to give someone else. They've been in those shoes before. So I try to make it a bit more personal. And so an approach that works well for me there is I've got a meeting with the executive team on Thursday at such and such a time. I know this is a question that's going to come up. Can you help me be prepared for that? And now what I've done is I've given a time frame where I've given them a little bit of time, not it's, hey, I need an update in the next 2 weeks, not get back to me when you can. It's here's the time, 24 to 36 hours away, where I'm asking them for an update during that time period so that I can be prepared on my side. And that usually works. And sometimes you get the response, which is, look, I just don't have anything to share. I'm not avoiding you because I don't want to have the conversation. I don't have any information to share. So you've got to be really careful about getting into your own head and creating your own personal objections when you're not getting that communication back from the client. And I don't know if I made that one clear, but I've seen it happen time and time again where people start jumping to conclusion on why a customer is not responding. They went with a competitor. They didn't like the price. Something else happened. Be careful about assuming.
Well, and I think that's the key. If there was one foundational thing that I would say that's important to understand about objections is that exact problem, which is assuming and making assumptions. Hearing something and then not clarifying or asking probing questions or really just trying to understand what you just heard. Because if there's any ambiguity or if you don't understand where it's really coming from and you make the wrong assumption, then you know what happens, right? And you end up in this circular discussion or you're talking past each other. And I think it's okay when you hear some sort of objection if somebody says, no, the price is just too high or something like that. Dive into that a little bit. Ask some questions about expectations or where they're coming from and have a conversation around it so that you really do understand what the driving forces are, what the real facts are. And it's I used to do a training session a couple of decades ago for sales, and we had a 1 hour sort of module on talking about objection handling. And the first thing we would talk about is, first of all, we dispelled the myth that every objection can be overcome. There's a lot of books out there and a lot of content out there about, it's kind of subsided over the years, but it used to be a time when there were books out there that would talk about how do you make all objections go away. And there was techniques and all these things that you would do to convince the buyer or the person that they didn't know what they were talking about, or all kinds of ways to pressure them to get past their reservations. I think we've kind of evolved as both buyers and sellers to not have that view, but every once in a while you'll run into that.
Mike, I have a question for you about objections, but more specifically about preparing for objections, because you're going to get them. Do you ever take the time before you have a sales conversation to walk through the possible objections that you're going to get from this person?
Jody, great question. I think it depends. So I would expect that before everybody has a scheduled call with someone, they're going through that process of game planning and determining, what are we going to talk about? What are some of the things that I want to get out of this conversation? What do I expect the customer to ask for? What questions do I anticipate are going to come up? What objections are they going to bring up? And I mean, Mike and I were talking about this the other day as we were kind of discussing a scenario. So I would expect that reps at a minimum should do this whenever they're getting engaged in a conversation with a customer where the expectation is you're going to continue to move your process forward. As far as game planning, some of that can be done on your own, where you just kind of anticipate, what questions do I expect will come up? What questions am I surprised that they haven't asked yet that I would have anticipated? And if it's the first time that if you're working on a complex deal, this is really where you can lean on other members of your sales team and members of sales leadership to ask them to help you with that game planning, help you with a bit of the role playing there. So yeah, I think you've got to go into those scenarios with a plan and preparation.
Well, and the other thing too is if you've been talking to multiple prospects or multiple customers that you're selling a product to, over a period of time, there's going to be a common theme with the objections that you hear. And that's an opportunity to figure out, okay, if I've heard this before, or if I hear this every time I talk to a customer, that's a chance to say, we should take a look at what our market is objecting to. And that's an opportunity to engage with your marketing folks or with your product team or whoever to give them feedback to say, this is what I'm hearing from a lot of the clients. This is where they're having a problem with what we offer. And one of the things, I think it's getting back to our theme of being a thinking process. I know that if you've heard objections before and you know the common answers or the way to get down to the core issues with those objections, you can certainly be prepared because you've been down that path before. I think there's a risk to over preparing or taking it for granted that, oh, I've heard this objection before, so here's the answer. And what I'm referencing is a lot of times sales reps get trained. If you hear this objection, here's the answer. If you hear this objection, here's the answer. The problem with that is you become a very rote, worse than even being assumptive, because now all you're doing is reading, here's the answer when I get that objection. And a lot of times it's not a one size fits all sort of objection. And so it takes the thing out of the process. So yes, you want to be prepared. Yes, you want to know how to navigate the conversation. No, you don't want to have a pop-up on your screen that says, if customer says A, here's your answer. That to me is where it kind of goes too far.
I can tell you, anytime that I've failed in handling an objection, it's when I've led off with a response, a direct response to that question. Meaning I start providing information based on the objection that was raised. When I handle objections well, I usually start with a question. And that question is around clarification. I want to make sure that I completely understand this thing that they're objecting. If it's price related, I go down that route. If it's platform related, I go down that route. But I want to be very careful. I know Mike said this a couple of times, but I think it's important for us to really hit this point home. Do not assume. Do not assume that you know why the customer is objecting in the way that they are, or that you've just got this canned answer. Like most of the other stuff we talk about, if your answer can be handled on the company FAQs, why do they need you?
And really, this isn't just a sales skill. This is just a general communications skill with anybody. I used to tell a story about my middle daughter, Madison. When she was 2 years old, she was one of those kids that always, when I was working in my home office at night, if she heard any kind of noise, she'd always want to get up and hang out with me. And it was funny because our house is all tile and everything. So you can hear when they have the little feeties in their pajamas, you can hear that plasticky shush shush sound coming down the hallway. And I could hear her coming, it'd be like 2 a.m. and here comes Maddie walking down the hallway. And handling objections with her about why she wouldn't want to go to bed is just the same as dealing with an objection in a sales process. In other words, she would come down to my office. Here she is, 2 years old. And rather than me communicate with her, ask her why she's come down the hallway to visit dad, I would just assume, she's just thirsty. So I'd grab her, a juice, little sippy cup, and then I would take her back to bed. And then an hour later, she's shushing down the hallway again. It's like never asking her questions, just assuming what I know the solution is. And you repeat the process of 3 or 4 times of her coming down that hallway before you ask the question, why are you hopping out of bed? And then she tells you actually what she would want or why she's out of bed to solve the problem, then the problem's solved. But it's really something you need to understand other people's perspectives. You need to understand where people are coming from and why it's important to them and communicate through it.
I think another thing to think about as you go through this is know that there are people on the customer side who are there specifically to raise objections. This can be part of their buying process. So don't look at this as something where you've got to respond or you've got to change your approach just based on a question that somebody asked. Help those people do whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. Like, on the price side, they want to make sure they're getting good value for what they're buying. Or maybe there's an instance where they just purely can't afford this thing that's being put in front of them. And it's less about current, or it's less about budget ever. It's more about timing. So again, I feel like we're kind of going through this a couple of different ways, but the couple of points that I would highlight are make sure that you're asking questions, minimize the number of assumptions that you're making, and don't just answer the question because you feel like that's what the customer wants to hear. Take a breath.
Yeah. And I would add one more thing to that. And we haven't really talked about this piece of it yet, but the worst objection that's out there that derails your process is the one you don't hear. And I got up because a couple of weeks ago, actually somebody got a hold of me about the demo podcast that we just released, and was frustrated with the way demos were proceeding. And I offered to just sort of be a fly on the wall during a demo. And when I listened to both sides of it, just as an observer, the one thing that I noted that happened in a 30-minute demo, it happened 4 times, is the customer went to either ask a question or had presented an objection, and the sales rep dismissed it or didn't even hear it. And so that was a big piece of the feedback. And that was one of the reasons why I was thinking about this as a topic, is the worst objection that you can deal with in a sales process is the one you don't hear. And my coaching to this individual was, when you're doing your demo, and this happened to be a virtual demo, so you weren't in the room, you couldn't read body language. It was a screen share, so it wasn't a video meeting, those kinds of things. And you have to really heighten your listening skills during those kinds of presentations, because that team or that person that you're presenting to, if they want to ask a question and you rail over them, or if they ask you a question, and to me, there were questions that it was pretty clear they were objections, but the person made an assumption about the question and basically deferred and said, "Oh, that's a great question. I think you'll see that later in the presentation," and basically rolled right over it and never covered it later on in the presentation. And so it was one of those things where at the end of that call, if I had to guess and say, if that prospect went cold on that sales rep, you could probably pinpoint it down to the point where, you had an opportunity to kind of have that conversation during the demo, but it never surfaced. So that's the one that can really get you, is the one you don't hear.
Yeah. So something that I heard as you were going through that is how important it is to listen, and listen with the intention of understanding rather than the intention to respond. And
Yep.
If that's just a common thing, I mean, we talk about this often. The ideas and concepts that we discuss are pretty basic. I mean, they're foundational skills. And, when people make errors, they usually come back to, a handful of things. I made an assumption. I didn't listen. I was working with the wrong person. Those are
too quick to respond.
Too quick. Yeah.
Without really having, full understanding. Those are all things, because I think the way our brain is wired is, once we hear what we think the question or the objection is, what we're really thinking about in a lot of cases, if we're not careful, is, how am I going to respond? And so what ends up happening is, once you think you have the objection and the customer's still talking, they start to sound like Charlie Brown's school teacher, right? Want, want, want. And all you're thinking about is, okay, I got the answer to this one. So as soon as my customer shuts up and comes up for air, then I've got the perfect answer, kind of thing. And so we stop listening. Yeah. That's what we've got to always, it's not rocket science. It's just something you always have to apply yourself to be committed to.
As I hear you two talk about this, it reminds me of my time as a park ranger. I used to tell people on staff that, look, I understand you may hear the same question 100 times in a week. Like, where is the bathroom at, for example? You may have heard it 100 times this week, but the person that just asked it, it's the first time they have asked that question. So I see how this applies to what you're talking about with objections. You may have heard the same objection 100 times, but it could be the very first time the person you're talking to has raised that as a concern or an objection, and that you have to handle it as an individual objection and not just put it in the bucket, I've heard that 100 times.
Yep.
Bingo.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So as we wrap up this episode about dealing with objections, what are the final thoughts you want us to know?
I think, so we didn't talk about one of the, and it's hard to hear because I actually do have a process map. Maybe I should upload that on the website that people could download. But basically, it is a communication process, and it has a workflow just like any other process has. But essentially, there are steps you go through. And I think one of the things we didn't talk about is a little bit of empathy that you can show when you do understand a person's objection, and you can basically restate it or empathize and relate it back to that person in demonstrating that you listened. And there are times when an objection is just going to be the deal breaker or whatever the case might be, but also being empathetic to the person that has that barrier, whatever it might be, and not taking a position of an adversarial sort of position, but understand the shoes that your prospect or customer is walking in, and let them know that you do understand where they're coming from. Just like Mike was saying earlier, that when you're asking for an update or a deliverable commitment or something like that, they understand that you're you're trying to do a job as well. So I think just showing some empathy in your communication is also, really important.
Definitely. And, anytime that you can take this from the perspective of the client, you're going to be in much better shape rather than taking it from the perspective of your business. Keep in mind, as reps, we all know our product. We all know feature functionality. We all know how or why it's better than our competitors, and we're passionate about those things. What you're working to do is you have these conversations with your client is get a better understanding of what's important to them, why it's important to them, how they communicate, what their process is. And if you can go to where your customer is, you'll be more successful, whether it's related to objection handling or proposal writing or any of the number of things that we get into, presentation delivery, etc.
Well, Mike and Mike, this has been a great episode about handling objections. Let me say this, if you enjoy these episodes, you can leave a review on iTunes, a rating and review, just to let us know how we're doing and how much you enjoy the show. Please feel free to reach out, connect with us on LinkedIn or Twitter at Catalyst Sale. Thank you again, Mike and Mike, and thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.